In this lecture, we're going to go through the steps to which we will work towards the establishment of a process called the scientific method, and it's all centered around the quest to obtain knowledge. And so when we talk about about obtaining knowledge, there are a number of different ways in which that is carried out. At the most basic level, the traditional mode is how most people obtain knowledge, but to do so is to understand the difference between anecdotal and scientific-based evidence. By definition, an anecdote refers to a short story about an interesting or funny event or occurrence, and this is a very common mode of communication between people. The problem with an anecdote is that it tends to overvalue personal experiences with a particular situation, as well as relying on anecdotes to draw conclusions which may or may not be accurate. The law of small numbers refers to extreme outcomes being more likely to occur when there are a small number of cases. So if there is a small sample size, we can certainly expect that extreme cases, extreme values, are likely going to influence the outcome of a particular examination, and that is grounded within statistical processes that we'll address later on. In doing so, the outlier is just exactly that individual case out of a small or large group that appears to be very distinct from the majority of other cases and usually represents an exception to the rule and can actually have an effect on overall statistical outcomes. But we go back to the mode in which information is typically obtained, and traditional means represents the most common way in which information is obtained by people through time. So skills are handed down over time, and the advantage here is that each subsequent generation in obtaining knowledge through tradition actually adds more and more to the information that is handed down. This tends to be a greater component of training programs than ongoing education. Now, the problem with traditional practice, is that it's not always grounded in evidence and is not necessarily aligned with the current state of knowledge with respect to a particular field. So this is the way we've always done it, and we're always going to do it this way. It doesn't usually capture what is referred to as best practices in carrying out some sort of task, be it in education, psychology, or engineering. The next level up from traditional information is authority, and that's where we rely on specialists in a particular area. So we seek out the services of psychologists, physicians, accountants, because these are individuals that have specific and detailed knowledge within their particular realm as a result of their unique training. There are potential drawbacks with authority, with using an authoritative figure to obtain information, because it's dependent on only one person. And so this will work if a specialist is well informed on the current best practices or best evidence in their particular field. It's not always possible to obtain information from a specialist or to get a referral to a specialist in actual practice. And even with if a person is able to obtain a referral to gain information from a specialist, there is very often a delay. The very common way, moving up one level to obtaining information that is used day to day, is through what's called trial and error. And that's where practice is altered based on trying something new. A person will try something new, the outcome is evaluated, and then modifications are made to carrying out the same task. So there are a series of iterations a person would go through in carrying out some task, and so at various stages the process or parts of the process are maintained, they're modified, or just simply eliminated. But of course that there are drawbacks to the trial and error method. It's not a systematic approach. It's usually a haphazard and almost chaotic type of approach in selecting different approaches to solving a problem. In using the trial and error, it's a challenge to determine why or why not a particular situation might work or a solution to a problem has worked, and the results, the outcome, often cannot be replicated. The method in which the scientific method applies incorporates what's called deductive and inductive reasoning, and sound research will involve a combination of these two modes of logical reasoning. Deductive reasoning involves the movement from obtaining a general observation, developing what's called a major premise, and then deducing from theory to arrive at a specific conclusion. Inductive reasoning takes the opposite approach, in which inductive reasoning will take a very, very specific observation, perhaps of just one case, and then generalize that to a larger group of individuals. And so when we talk about inductive and deductive reasoning, we're using a logical approach that can be replicated in generating a solution to a problem. And both of these approaches are combined in sound research design and execution of that designed research approach. And so to take a very specific example of how deductive and inductive reasoning differs, with deductive reasoning, we know that research has established that dementia increases into older age. And so if we just only use deductive reasoning and we take this very general observation, we might specifically conclude that my grandfather, because my grandfather is of an older age, if we accept this major premise, my grandfather must have dementia. If we just focus on an inductive approach, and with the inductive approach, we just focus on a very specific case. And so if my grandfather has dementia, I would generally conclude that all older adults must have dementia. And so what we see here are potential problems if we only take an isolated deductive approach or an isolated inductive approach. But the research process and the scientific method is sound because it incorporates both inductive and deductive reasoning. The scientific method is a very systematic and controlled process and involves a very clear sequence of events that can be replicated. As mentioned in an earlier lecture, the empirical approach is referring to the documentation of objective data through direct observation. And this is done so that two different observers will obtain the same or very similar pieces of information if the approach that is used to obtain that information is the same. The scientific method incorporates a process called control, and that's where steps are taken to control factors that would interfere with a study and influence the outcome of a particular investigation. And so generally the scientific method will involve deducing a question from theory. And so from a very general observation, a major premise is established, but instead of just jumping to a conclusion, the deduction from theory will set up a process to collect and analyze data. So direct observations are made from a group of research participants, and that will provide an answer to the question. And so once the data are collected, compiled, and analyzed, the findings are then interpreted, and then we would apply inductive reasoning based upon a very small, a relatively small subset of a larger population to arrive at a very specific conclusion. And so to be a little bit more specific with the scientific method involves in making an observation, and in making an observation that will require the formulation of a research question and an educated guess. That educated guess is referred to as the research hypothesis. So the researcher will have some idea as to what the potential outcome may be. In generating that research question, an experiment, an approach is designed to answering that question. The experiment, the methods of that experiment are then executed to collect the data, and the results will provide a direct answer to a very direct question that was posed earlier. And the results are analyzed through the use of various statistical procedures. So the statistical procedures represent a set of tools that are selected based upon the design of the experiment. From the analysis of the data, we then would draw conclusions, and from those conclusions we might formulate a new hypothesis. A critical element of the scientific method at the very end here is replication. So can these results be replicated if we repeat the process on a different set of research participants? And so this whole process is not just used to conduct an experiment. It's actually a very critical part of clinical practice. And so an original research study can be conducted using this process, and consulting with the most published research is also going to be a very critical component, not just with generating a research approach, but also as part of clinical practice. Some of the key skills involved in generating a sound research approach involves skepticism. And so skepticism is a critical and necessary part of the scientific method, in that we're always questioning the outcome of research studies. But skepticism will only work if an open mind is maintained in considering various alternatives and to reduce the influence that a personal bias may have on how the individual researcher or scientist would interpret a science-based outcome. In doing so, we maintain objectivity, that our bias could be correct or it could be incorrect. And this certainly involves taking the empirical approach in generating conclusions from direct observations. The non-empirical approach will often raise more questions to how the research was carried out, and therefore the conclusions. Another another element of the scientific method that is probably not used quite as often but can be very critical to a sound research approach is by applying creativity, where the researcher would tap into a wide range of different established approaches in generating a sound research study. And finally, once the research is completed, the ability to communicate the outcome of that research is going to be critical. A sound research project may generate very important outcomes, but if those outcomes cannot be communicated, nobody will hear of them or understand it. And replication is part of that communication process. And so what we're seeing here on this on this image in this table is a accepted approach in that mode of written communication that reflects the scientific method. And so in generating a research paper, a title page identifies the work and the authors and their institutional affiliations that carried out the work, and the authors listed on a research report must have made a substantial contribution to the generation of that study. The abstract is usually a one-page summary of the entire report or of the entire research project. The introduction provides a foundation for identifying the problem that the research approach is going to address, and the introduction in a research report always finishes with a clear statement of the purpose of the study and the hypothesis or hypotheses of that research purpose that follow the research purpose statement. The method sections provide an outline of a step-by-step approach of how the experiment or the study was carried out, to include sufficient detail that another person or group not affiliated with the study can take this study and can take the methods and replicate the study in the way that the original researchers carried it out. The results outline the statistical approaches and the statistical findings of the methods, and the discussion is an interpretation of the statistical outcome by making reference back to the introduction, the purpose, and the hypotheses. So the first part of a discussion section of a research report should directly confirm or refute the research hypotheses that were stated at the end of the introductory portion of the research report, and the references or bibliography section provides a very important source of the contrasting or supporting documentation from other sources not affiliated or could be affiliated with the authors of this research study. So this concludes this lecture of part 3 of our Unit 1.